The boardroom on the 38th floor of the Caldwell-Briggs Tower smelled like money and old leather, the kind of room where decisions got made before anyone walked through the door. And that was exactly what Marcus Aldridge felt the moment he stepped inside. That everything had already been decided, and he had simply been invited to watch. 6 members of the Voss family sat arranged along one side of the table like a jury who had already voted. Sterling Voss at the center, silver-haired and still, the kind of man who never raised his voice because he'd never needed to. His daughter Claudine to his left, watching Marcus the way you watch something you're about to buy. His 2 sons flanking them both, their expressions identically unreadable. And at the far end, the family's legal counsel slid a document across the polished mahogany without looking up, the way you might slide food through a slot. $1.2 billion, the attorney said. Conagen on full operational transfer within 90 days. And for a moment, Marcus just stood there because the number itself seemed to take up physical space in the room. $1.2 billion. He had started Bridgepath Analytics in a rented basement in Kitchener with 2 monitors, 1 folding table, and a daughter who slept in a pack-and-play behind him because he couldn't afford childcare on those early nights. And now this number was sitting on a piece of paper being offered to him by people who had never once struggled to sleep. He turned the first page. Then the second. Then the one where the language shifted from polished into something else entirely. Because buried beneath the strategic phrasing and the indemnity clauses was the actual offer. Not a partnership, not an acquisition with a transition plan, but a quiet erasure. A founder title with no board seat, an advisory role with no vote, a face they could put on a press release and then quietly stop calling. Before Marcus could respond, Sterling Voss leaned back in his chair, the faint movement of a man completely at ease. "You've built something workable," he said. His voice was even, almost generous in the way that certain kinds of dismissal are. "But let's not confuse a strong prototype with a sustainable enterprise. Men in your position catch the wave once. The smart ones know when to cash out before it pulls them under." Quiet laughter moved around the table. Not loud, not cruel, exactly. Just the kind of sound a room makes when it forgets that the person being discussed is still in it. Claudine didn't laugh. She studied Marcus instead with the calm precision of someone trying to determine how much of him was actually necessary. And that was when it settled over him. Not rage, but something colder and more clarifying. The specific humiliation of being evaluated in your own story by people who hadn't written a single word of it. He had been awake since 4 that morning. He'd made Nora's lunch before the sun came up. Cream cheese on a whole wheat wrap, the crusts cut off because she was 6 and still cared about things like that. He'd braided her hair badly, like he always did, and she'd fixed it herself in the hallway mirror without complaint, just tilted her head and quietly redone the left side while he held her backpack. He'd dropped her at Hillside Primary, watched her run through the gate without looking back, the way confident children do. And now he was here, in a room that smelled like someone else's certainty, being told he didn't understand what he had built. His hand went into his jacket pocket. Not deliberately, just reflex. His phone was there, screen locked, and without thinking, he pressed it just enough to see the wallpaper. Nora sitting on the dock at his parents' place in Muskoka last August, soaking wet and laughing at something off-camera, her gap-toothed grin catching the light. Something inside him went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with calm. It was more like a compass needle finding north. Steady, certain, done arguing with itself. He looked back at the table. The Voss family was still there, still arranged, still watching. The contract still waited. The number still floated in the air between them like a test that hadn't announced itself as one. Marcus closed the document. The sound was small, but it carried. Every head lifted. He pushed it back across the table slowly, without performance, the way you return something that was never actually yours to keep. "You're not buying my company," he said, and his voice was quieter than he'd expected it to be, which somehow made it land harder. "You're buying a version of it that I don't recognize, and I don't sell things I don't recognize." He met Sterling Voss's gaze then, held it. Not as a challenge, just as a fact. And for the first time since he'd walked into that room, the room didn't feel like it belonged to the Voss family entirely. Something had shifted, not much, but enough. Marcus Aldridge didn't take the elevator down slowly for dramatic effect. He took it down quickly because his parking was only validated for 2 hours, and he still hadn't figured out what he was going to tell his team. The October air outside the tower hit him like cold water, which was exactly what he needed. Bay Street was moving at its usual indifferent pace. Couriers, umbrellas, someone arguing into a phone. Nobody knew what had just happened on the 38th floor. Nobody particularly cared. His own phone buzzed before he reached the parking structure. His operations director, Priya, 3 messages in 90 seconds. "Tell me it didn't happen." Then, Marcus. Then just call me. He didn't call. Not yet. He sat in his car in the parkade for 4 minutes, engine off, staring at the concrete wall in front of him. $1.2 billion. He had walked away from $1.2 billion. His daughter needed braces next year. He still had a line of credit he'd taken out in 2019 that he hadn't fully paid down. His company employed 63 people, most of them in their 30s with mortgages and kids of their own. The fear wasn't abstract. It was specific, and it had his team's faces on it. He drove to the office. The meeting room on the second floor of the Bridgepath space in the distillery district was not glass-walled or 40 stories up. It had exposed brick, a whiteboard with old marker residue that never fully erased, and a coffee maker that made noise for 3 minutes before producing anything useful. His core team was already there when he arrived. Priya, their chief architect, James Boateng, his head of partnerships, Simone Achterberg. 2 senior engineers whose expressions told him they'd already read the business press alerts on their phones. Nobody sat. They stood the way people stand when they need to be able to move. Priya spoke first. Tell me there's still a path to renegotiation. Marcus sat down to decide whether to stay standing or join him. One by one they sat. There isn't, he said. I walked away. It's done. The silence that followed was not the polite kind. It was the kind with weight. James looked at his hands. Simone looked at the window. One of the engineers exhaled slowly through his nose. 63 employees, Marcus. Priya kept her voice flat, which was worse than if she'd raised it. 63 people who have rent and car payments and families. We're not a startup with 4 people who can weather a pivot. We have obligations. I know what we have. Then explain to me what you were thinking. Not accusatory. Genuinely asking, which cut deeper. He had thought about this on the drive over. How to say it in a way that wasn't just idealism dressed up as strategy, because they'd worked with him long enough to know the difference. They weren't acquiring us, he said. They were dissolving us into their infrastructure. Every decision, every direction, every hire. We would have had advisory input and zero authority. Bridgepath would have existed as a brand on their stationery and nothing else inside 2 years. I've seen it happen to 3 companies in this space in the last 4 years. That's not a guarantee, James said carefully. That's a risk assessment, yes. And so is this. This is a certainty, Priya said. The Voss Group doesn't forgive public rejections. We're going to feel this. Marcus didn't argue with that because she was right, and they all knew it. The Voss family was not the kind of institution that accepted no and moved on. They were the kind that made a note. His phone was face down on the table, and it had been buzzing periodically since before he sat down. He flipped it over now. Not messages from partners. News alerts. 3 separate outlets had already run the story, which meant someone in that boardroom had briefed someone before he'd made it back to his car. The narrative was already being written. Young CEO rejects landmark deal. Future uncertain, investors spooked. Simone looked at her own phone. 2 of our partnership conversations are showing delays. Both sent holding messages within the last hour. She looked up. That's not coincidence. No, Marcus said. It's not. And that was the moment the abstraction became concrete for everyone in the room. This wasn't going to be a news cycle. This was going to be systematic. The Voss Group had reach in every direction that mattered. Investment circles, regulatory relationships, industry boards. They didn't need to attack openly. They just needed to make people hesitant, and in business, hesitation was its own kind of damage. James leaned forward. What's the play? Marcus looked around the table at people who had trusted him with years of their careers. Give me 72 hours, he said. I need you to keep running the business like the last 8 hours didn't happen. If I can't show you a different path by Thursday morning, we'll have a different conversation. Priya held his gaze for a long moment. The trust in it was complicated. Not unconditional, not fragile, but honest. She'd seen him navigate things that looked impossible before. She'd also seen him be wrong. Thursday, she said. Not a question. Thursday, he confirmed. He drove home at 6:15. The highway was the way it always was in October, and he listened to the radio without processing any of it. The sky over the lake was the color it only gets in fall, that deep orange that lasts exactly 10 minutes before it disappears. Nora was at the kitchen table with her homework when he came in. His mother, Shirley, was at the counter cutting apple slices, which she put out every evening whether anyone asked for them or not. It was one of the things she did since moving in 2 years ago after his divorce. Small, reliable rituals that held the shape of normal. You're later than you said, Nora mentioned, not looking up from her worksheet. She said it the way she said most things, as information, not complaint. I know. He hung his jacket and crouched beside her chair. What are we working on? Fractions. She held up her pencil. I hate fractions. Fractions are useful, he said. So is knowing how to drive, and I can't do that either. He laughed, actually laughed, for the first time since that morning, and it felt like something unknotting. His mother glanced at him over Nora's head. She had a way of reading him that had nothing to do with what he said. It was in the set of his shoulders, something she'd been able to see since he was 12. She put a plate of apple slices near his elbow and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing to say. He sat with Nora while she finished the fractions. He didn't think about the Voss family. He didn't think about Priya's expression or the news alerts or the delayed partnership responses. He thought about 5/8 and 3/4 and whether the answer his daughter had written for question 7 was going to require a gentle correction or could be left as a learning moment. He left question 7 for the learning moment. After dinner, after Nora was in bed and his mother had gone to her room with her book, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and the folder he had not shown anyone yet. Not his team, not his investors, not his lawyer. He had started building it 18 months ago, quietly, in the hours after Nora went to sleep. Not as a backup plan, not out of paranoia, but because he had seen something in their predictive analytics architecture that nobody else had thought to look for, a way to apply the same pattern recognition model they'd built for financial risk assessment to infrastructure vulnerability mapping. Critical systems, power grids, municipal water, transportation networks. The kind of application that wasn't just commercially significant, it was the kind of thing governments needed. He had 3 conversations already underway with people who understood this. A senior advisor in the Federal Infrastructures Ministry in Ottawa, a retired cybersecurity director who now consulted at the highest levels of 5 provincial governments, and a private equity partner in Calgary who specialized in exactly this sector and had been waiting for exactly this technology. None of them were connected to the Voss group. None of them needed to be. He opened the encrypted folder and started making calls. By Thursday morning, the shape of things had shifted. Not loudly, not in a way the press could see yet. But the 3 conversations had become 7, and 2 of those 7 had moved to term sheets. The partnerships the Voss group had quietly pressured into holding had received countercalls from people with significantly more pull in their specific sectors, and the holding messages had begun to quietly unhold. Marcus walked into the Bridgepath office at 7:45. His team was already there because they always were. He didn't give a speech. He set up his laptop, pulled up 3 documents, and walked them through what had been sitting in the encrypted folder for 18 months. The architecture, the sector application, the conversations that were now on paper. The silence in the room this time was a different kind. James leaned forward about 4 minutes in and didn't lean back for the rest of the presentation. Simone asked 3 questions in quick succession, each one sharper than the last. Priya didn't say anything until he finished, and then she said, "You built this while we were building everything else?" "The core framework was already there," Marcus said. "I just applied it differently." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because I didn't know yet if it was real, and I didn't want to pivot a 63-person company towards something I hadn't verified." He paused. "I verified it." Priya looked at the documents, then back at him. "The Voss group is going to figure out what you're doing. Yes, probably within a week. And then they'll want back in, on our terms." She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee mug and held it without drinking from it, a thing she did when she was running calculations. "Thursday," she finally said. "Thursday," he agreed. "Okay," she said, and that was all. The invitation came on a Wednesday. Hawthorne Capital, the Voss Group's primary investment arm, requested a meeting. The language had changed from the first time. Still formal, still precise, but the register was different. The certainty was gone from it. In its place was something that sounded, if Marcus was reading correctly, like an institution that had miscalculated and was now adjusting its position without wanting to say so directly. He accepted the meeting. Then he called his Ottawa contact, then his Calgary partner, then he made sure the term sheets were countersigned and time-stamped before he walked into that building again. The same boardroom, same glass walls, same October light coming through at the same angle. But Marcus sat down this time, didn't wait to be directed, just found a chair and sat in it, and the small normalcy of that act shifted the air in the room before anyone had spoken. Sterling Voss entered last. He looked the same, composed, unreadable, but something in the arrangement of the room wasn't landing the way he was accustomed to. He sat. His daughter Claudine took the seat beside him. His legal counsel opened a notepad and uncapped a pen. Nobody spoke for a moment. Sterling Voss broke the silence. "You've been active," he said, "not an accusation. More like a man acknowledging a move on a board he'd thought he was controlling." "I've been working," Marcus said. "Same as always. We've heard about the federal conversations. I imagine you have." Claudine's gaze shifted from her father to Marcus and back, recalibrating. Sterling folded his hands on the table. The patience in the gesture was the patience of a man who had won most of his arguments over a long career, and who was now sitting across from a variable he hadn't accounted for properly. "What would it take," he said, "to have a different conversation than the one we had 3 weeks ago?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He let the question sit in the room for a few seconds, not as a tactic, but because he genuinely wanted to say the right thing. "Ownership," he said finally. "Real ownership. Board representation. Decisions about product direction and company culture that stay with us. Not advisory input. Actual authority." He looked at Sterling. "Your group gets significant financial return and access to a sector you can't otherwise enter. We get to remain what we built." A pause. "You're asking us to be a minority stakeholder," Claudine said. "I'm asking you to be a partner," Marcus said. "Not the same thing." Sterling Voss studied him. Not the way he had in their first meeting. Not evaluation. Not measurement. This was different. This was the look of a man reconsidering a conclusion he'd reached too quickly. "You understand," Sterling said, "that this isn't how we typically operate." "I understand that completely," Marcus said. "I also understand that the infrastructure application we've built is the only architecture in this country capable of what the federal government needs, and that the window for being the first to bring it to them is approximately 4 months. You can be part of that, or you can watch it happen." The room was quiet. Claudine closed the folder she'd been holding. Slowly. The way someone closes something when they've finished deciding. "We'll need a week to review the updated framework," she said. "Of course," Marcus said. He gathered his documents, straightened them against the table, and stood. Not dramatically. "Just done. I'll have my team send the technical package by Friday." He was almost at the door when Sterling Voss spoke again. Not loudly, just enough to carry. "Mr. Aldridge." Marcus turned. Sterling's expression was still composed, but there was something different at the edge of it. Not warmth exactly, but the particular quality of respect that certain people can only offer when they've had no choice but to arrive at it. "You held your position." Marcus looked at him for a moment. "I've been doing that for 6 years, he said. "It's not new." He walked out. The door closed behind him with a sound that felt like something completing. It was a Friday night in November when it finally started to feel real. Not the term sheets or the news articles that had reversed their tone, or the partnership calls that came back around after the federal announcement. Those had all felt significant in a business sense, but significance in a business sense was not the same as feeling real. What felt real was Nora. She was on the couch beside him with her sock feet tucked under her, and a book she wasn't actually reading balanced on her knees, because what she was actually doing was watching him to make sure he was okay. He had noticed her doing this more in the past month, not worried, exactly. Just monitoring. The way kids do when they understand more than you've told them. He set down his phone. No more notifications for tonight. He decided that at the parking lot and looked at her. "You've been watching me read for 20 minutes, he said. She looked down at her book as though she'd been doing nothing of the kind. "I was also reading." He leaned over and looked at the page. She hadn't turned it since he'd sat down. "What happens next?" A pause. "I'm not sure yet," she said carefully. He laughed again, the way he'd been laughing more lately. Real laughs, not polite ones. She glanced up at him. Did the stuff at work get better? He thought about how to answer that. He'd told her simply that there had been some hard meetings and some hard decisions and that things were sorting themselves out. She had accepted this, though he could tell she'd been filing it away. "Yeah," he said. "It got better." She nodded, seemed to weigh this. Then she turned a page in her book, the right page this time, probably, and leaned slightly sideways until her shoulder was against his arm. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Outside the window, so the city was doing what cities do at night, indifferent to the particular weight of any one person's week. The street lights were coming on along the avenue, and somewhere in the building above them, someone was cooking something that smelled like garlic and tomato. Marcus sat there in the quiet with his daughter's weight against his arm and thought about the meeting in the boardroom and the encrypted folder and the 72 hours and his team's faces when he'd walked them through what he'd been building in the hours when Nora was asleep. He thought about his mother cutting apple slices without being asked. He thought about Nora fixing her own braid in the hallway mirror and not making it a thing. He hadn't built Bridgepath for a number on a contract. He had built it in the specific hours that existed around the edges of being a father, in the in-between time. After school pickup and before she woke up, on weekends when she was at her grandmother's, in those particular quiet stretches where the apartment was still, and something in him that couldn't rest during daylight hours could finally think. And the thing about that kind of building, the kind you do in the margins, with everything else already carrying its full weight, is that it turns out to be nearly impossible to take away from someone. Not because it's protected by a contract or a board or a valuation, but because it comes from something that other people can't replicate, something that isn't captured in the financial projections or the technical architecture. It comes from not having any other option except to get it right. Sterling Voss had said he'd held his position, but holding his position wasn't the thing that had changed the room. The thing that had changed the room was knowing, with complete clarity, that the position was worth holding, and that was a thing you couldn't negotiate your way into or buy at any price. Nora turned another page. The garlic smell drifted past again. The streetlights held steady. Marcus Aldridge put his phone in his pocket and stayed where he was.